The constable arrived at Miss Marple's cottage just past 11 o'clock, his helmet slightly askew, and his expression suggesting that he had been running through village lanes with considerably more haste than dignity. Police Constable Martin, a competent enough young man who had known Miss Marple all his life, seemed almost relieved to find her at home, as though her presence alone might restore some semblance of order to a morning that had spiraled into the sort of chaos that small villages were entirely unprepared to manage. He explained, with the careful deference that country policemen reserve for village institutions, that Superintendent Willoughby had requested that she make herself available for questioning, not as a suspect, naturally, but as someone whose observations of village life were reputed to be remarkably comprehensive. Miss Marple smiled at this characterization. She was aware that her habit of attending to details that others considered insignificant had earned her a reputation for being observant, though she suspected that Superintendent Willoughby was considerably less impressed with this reputation than Constable Martin seemed to be. She invited him in, offered him tea, which he declined with the nervous energy of a man still too shocked by circumstances to manage ordinary courtesies, and assured him that she was quite prepared to speak with the superintendent whenever he might require it. Within the hour, she found herself installed in the morning room at Thornfield Manor, a space that had always struck her as uncomfortable despite its evident expense, all dark wood paneling and heavy furniture arranged with a sort of geometric precision that suggested a mind more concerned with demonstrating superiority than with creating warmth. Superintendent Willoughby was a man of perhaps 60, with the weathered face of someone who had spent considerable time observing human nature from a position of authority, and he greeted Miss Marple with a respect that seemed genuine rather than merely performed. He positioned himself in Sir Humphrey's chair, or rather, the chair that had until this morning belonged to Sir Humphrey, and outlined the circumstances of the death with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to presenting facts to juries and magistrates. Sir Humphrey had been found at approximately 8:30 that morning by Mrs. Coleman, who had brought his breakfast tea and discovered him slumped over his desk, a brass letter opener with a mother-of-pearl handle protruding from between his shoulder blades. The blow, according to the preliminary assessment of the local doctor, had been delivered with considerable force and would have caused death fairly rapidly, suggesting that the murderer had possessed either significant strength or adequate knowledge of human anatomy. The study door had been locked from the inside when Mrs. Coleman first attempted entry, and she had been forced to fetch Peters, who had used his key to gain access. The window remained latched, and there was no evidence of forced entry through any other means. Curiously, the desk appeared to have been searched with some urgency, papers scattered, drawers pulled open, and the contents of the wall safe, which stood partially ajar behind a portrait, apparently undisturbed, as though the intruder had either not known of its existence or had been interrupted before reaching it. As for the household at the time of death, Miss Violet had been in the morning room reading correspondence. As was her custom, Peters had been working in the rose garden, and Mrs. Coleman had been occupied with kitchen duties. Edward Ashford, the nephew, had arrived late the previous evening and was presumed to have been in his usual guest bedroom, though he had not been observed until nearly 9 o'clock, when he had emerged from his room in response to the commotion caused by the discovery. Miss Marple listened to this recitation with apparent docility, her hands folded in her lap, her expression betraying nothing beyond the mild interest one might display toward any narrative, however dramatic. She asked a few gentle questions when the superintendent paused, whether Sir Humphrey had seemed worried or preoccupied in recent weeks, whether there had been any recent visitors of significance, whether anyone had mentioned financial difficulties or legal complications. Superintendent Willoughby seemed slightly surprised by the specificity of her inquiries, and he answered them with a thoroughness that suggested he was accustomed to dealing with official investigators rather than retired school teachers. Yes, there had been a letter from a solicitor in London that had arrived 3 days prior, the contents of which seemed to have disturbed Sir Humphrey considerably. Yes, there had been a visitor on Monday evening, a gentleman from town whose identity Mrs. Coleman could not establish, as he had arrived as the household was settling for dinner and had requested privacy with the judge. Yes, there had been several telephone calls over the past week from someone whose identity had not been disclosed to the household staff. As for financial difficulties, Sir Humphrey had always appeared sufficiently prosperous, though his nephew Edward had apparently requested a loan some months prior, which had been refused with what Mrs. Coleman described as considerable harshness. Miss Marple absorbed these details with the quiet concentration of someone attending to a recipe or a knitting pattern, storing them away in that remarkable memory of hers where facts accumulated like fabric samples, each retaining its individual characteristics, but gradually revealing a pattern that might not be immediately apparent to less patient observers. She thanked Superintendent Willoughby for his courtesy in allowing her to speak with him, assured him of her willingness to assist in any manner he might require, and suggested, with the utmost gentleness, that he might wish to speak with the vicar, as Sir Humphrey had made a substantial donation to the church merely a week prior, and people often confide their concerns to clergymen when they find themselves troubled by matters of conscience. By the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage that afternoon, the village of St. Edmunds had been thoroughly transformed by the alchemy of gossip and speculation that only a murder could produce. Every shop on the high street thrummed with conversation, every garden fence became a conference point, and every telephone line hummed with the delicious transmission of rumour, conjecture, and outright fabrication. Mrs. Hendricks, who kept the post office and could therefore be relied upon to know which conversations had taken place via telephone, reported that Edward Ashford had apparently called his bank in London and inquired about his account balance with particular urgency, a detail which Mrs. Hendricks interpreted as evidence of his guilt and his desperation for funds. Meanwhile, Miss Violet had been observed at the market, looking considerably more composed than a devoted sister ought to appear mere hours after her brother's death, a circumstance which several village matrons found deeply suspicious, despite the obvious possibility that Miss Violet was simply a woman of controlled temperament. Peters, the groundskeeper, had apparently been seen speaking with a stranger near the manor gates on Monday evening, leading to speculation that he might have admitted the mysterious visitor mentioned by Superintendent Willoughby. The vicar himself had mentioned, in confidence to Mrs. Ashworth, who had mentioned it to her daughter-in-law, who had mentioned it to the butcher, that Sir Humphrey had indeed confided certain troubles to him, though the sanctity of the confessional prevented revelation of specifics. What emerged from all this ferment of speculation was a portrait of a man whose life, once examined closely, appeared considerably less secure than his dignified bearing had suggested, and whose relationships with those around him seemed fraught with tensions that polite society had previously masked with conventional courtesies. Miss Marple spent her evening as she spent most evenings, with her knitting and her thoughts, though her needles moved with perhaps slightly less regularity than usual, as though some portion of her concentration was engaged elsewhere. She had lived long enough to recognize that the village's instinctive theories, while not necessarily incorrect in their conclusion, were almost certainly incorrect in their reasoning. The human mind, she had observed, possessed a remarkable tendency to seize upon the most obvious explanation and cling to it with the fervor of a drowning man to driftwood, even when that explanation required an improbable concatenation of circumstances. Edward Ashford, for instance, made a convenient suspect precisely because he needed money and because his uncle was known to have refused him, two facts that the village found compelling without pausing to consider that if Edward had murdered his uncle for money, he would presumably have stolen from the desk or the safe, rather than merely ransacking them. Similarly, Peters had become suspect simply because he had been observed speaking with a stranger, though casual conversation between village tradesman and visitor. Was hardly an unusual occurrence. As for Miss Violet, her composure was being interpreted as evidence of guilt, when it might equally suggest nothing more than a lifetime of practice at maintaining social propriety in the face of shock. Miss Marple had learned that human nature was considerably more intricate than village logic allowed, and that the most significant details were almost always those that people failed to notice because they seemed too ordinary to merit attention. The next morning brought Superintendent Willoughby himself to her cottage, accompanied by a young constable carrying a leather portfolio. The superintendent seemed troubled in a way that suggested his initial confidence in the straightforwardness of the case had begun to erode, and Miss Marple recognized in his demeanor the particular frustration of a methodical investigator confronted with evidence that refused to arrange itself into coherent patterns. He explained that certain details had emerged during more thorough questioning of the household that complicated the matter considerably. Mrs. Coleman, when pressed about the timing of her discovery, had admitted with considerable reluctance that she had not, in fact, brought Sir Humphrey his breakfast tea precisely at 8 o'clock, as was her usual routine, but rather had delayed nearly 40 minutes due to a minor crisis in the kitchen involving a broken window in the pantry. Peters, when questioned about the stranger observed at the manor gates, had eventually acknowledged that the gentleman in question was his estranged brother, whom he had not seen for 10 years and who had appeared unexpectedly, seeking to reconcile family differences. Edward Ashford, when confronted about his telephone call to the bank, had admitted that he was not, as the village had assumed, fleeing from suspicion, but rather that his own business interests had suffered, a reversal requiring him to assess his financial situation with some urgency. Most intriguingly, the examination of Sir Humphrey's study had revealed that despite the apparent ransacking, nothing of obvious value appeared to be missing. No jewelry, no cash, no documents of apparent significance. Superintendent Willoughby placed several items before Miss Marple: a letter from a London solicitor concerning a legal matter that appeared to involve a former case of Sir Humphrey's from his judicial days, a telephone bill indicating regular calls to a number in Kent, and a small appointment book in which certain dates were marked with cryptic initials. He observed, with a directness that suggested he valued her opinion more than he valued official protocol, that Miss Marple seemed to possess an unusual gift for understanding the machinery of human motivation, and he wondered whether she might be willing to attend certain conversations with the household members, not formally as an investigator, but merely as an elderly village acquaintance whose presence might encourage people to speak with greater candor than they might employ with constables and superintendents. Miss Marple accepted this invitation with a grace that masked the satisfaction she felt at having her intuitions validated by official authority, and within 2 hours she found herself seated in the morning room at Thornfield Manor with Superintendent Willoughby and Mrs. Coleman, the housekeeper presenting a figure of controlled anxiety that suggested she had spent considerable time rehearsing what she might say and what she must certainly not reveal. The superintendent's approach was methodical and patient, allowing long silences to accumulate in which Mrs. Coleman felt compelled to fill the void with increasingly detailed elaborations of her story. What emerged was a portrait of a household considerably more calm, placated than the initial interviews had suggested. Sir Humphrey, Mrs. Coleman explained, had been a man of rigid routine and rigid expectations, demanding precision in every domestic detail, yet simultaneously capable of extraordinary generosity when moved to charitable impulse. Miss Violet, by contrast, had lived a life of careful subjugation to her brother's preferences, rising when he wished, dining when he wished, and maintaining an existence that seemed to have no particular purpose beyond the maintenance of his comfort. The arrival of Edward some months prior had introduced a tension into the household that had steadily accumulated, for Edward had apparently entertained aspirations toward a business venture requiring considerable capital, and when Sir Humphrey had refused to provide the necessary funds, a coldness had settled between them that no amount of conventional family politeness could entirely conceal. The mysterious visitor on Monday evening had arrived with the appearance of someone accustomed to authority, and though Miss Marple did not press Mrs. Coleman for details beyond what she had already provided, her silence itself seemed to encourage further revelation. Mrs. Coleman mentioned, almost in passing, that the visitor had been shown into the study immediately upon his arrival, and that she had heard raised voices emanating from that room for approximately 20 minutes before the gentleman had departed, leaving Sir Humphrey in a state of considerable agitation that had persisted through dinner and into the evening. After Mrs. Coleman had been dismissed, Miss Marple accompanied Superintendent Willoughby to speak with Miss Violet, whom they discovered in the garden room, arranging flowers with the precise attention to detail that suggested either genuine aesthetic sensibility or a desperate need for occupation, to prevent contemplation of her present. Circumstances. Miss Violet was a thin, precise woman with features that had once perhaps been pretty, but had been refined over decades into an expression of controlled melancholy, and her greeting to Miss Marple suggested genuine warmth despite the grim circumstances. She offered tea, which was accepted, and settled herself with the resignation of someone preparing for an ordeal that must be endured with dignity. The superintendent's questions were gentle but relentless, and Miss Violet's answers revealed a woman whose entire life had been organized around accommodation to her brother's demands and preferences. She had possessed independent means, she explained, but had allowed Sir Humphrey to manage her finances after their parents' death, trusting his judgment and his assurance that her capital was being invested prudently for her ultimate security. When Miss Marple asked, with the casual interest of one passing acquaintance inquiring of another, whether Miss Violet had ever contemplated marriage or an independent establishment, the question seemed to produce an unexpected response. A flash of something, pain perhaps or resentment, crossed Miss Violet's face, and she responded with unusual bitterness that she had once entertained such expectations, but that Sir Humphrey had made his position regarding her marriage entirely clear. He had required her presence, he had stated, for his own comfort and convenience, and any romantic entanglement would constitute a betrayal of family duty. Miss Marple said nothing, but she registered this information with the same careful attention she brought to everything, storing it away alongside the other facts she had accumulated. The conversation with Edward proved considerably more adversarial in nature, though Superintendent Willoughby maintained his patient demeanor throughout. Edward was a man who possessed the superficial charm of someone practiced in social performance, but who seemed to harbor considerable resentment beneath that polished exterior. He admitted readily enough that he had required funds for his business venture, and that his uncle had refused them, dismissing his requests with contempt and referring to his lack of business acumen. He acknowledged that this refusal had created tension between them, but he insisted, with an emphasis that seemed designed to convince himself as much as his interrogators, that whatever his feelings toward his uncle, he would not have harmed him, particularly not in circumstances that would inevitably direct suspicion toward himself. When Superintendent Willoughby pressed him regarding his whereabouts on Monday evening, Edward's account proved less than entirely clear. He had arrived at the manor late, he explained, and had gone directly to his room without encountering anyone. He had not, he insisted, known of the mysterious visitor's presence until the following morning when the commotion of discovery had awakened him. Miss Marple observed him carefully throughout this recitation, noting the tension in his jaw, the manner in which his fingers unconsciously clenched and unclenched, the way his eyes avoided direct contact with the superintendent's gaze. When she asked, with apparent innocence, whether he had heard any unusual sounds during the night, raised voices, for instance, Edward's response was perhaps a fraction too quick, his denial perhaps a shade too emphatic. He had taken a sleeping draught, he explained, as the journey from London had fatigued him considerably, and he had heard nothing whatsoever until morning. Miss Marple accepted this explanation with her characteristic courtesy, but she filed away this observation with the others, like pieces of a puzzle that had not yet revealed their ultimate configuration, but whose edges were beginning then to suggest a pattern. That evening, Miss Marple requested a private audience with Superintendent Willoughby at her cottage, and when he arrived with the slightly uncertain demeanor of a man aware that he was about to hear observations that might complicate an investigation already rendered complex by the absence of clear suspects, she greeted him with her customary warmth and offered him her best sherry and a plate of biscuits that she had baked that very afternoon. She began not with accusations or theories, but rather with a question posed with apparent casualness, whether the superintendent had yet discovered the identity of the gentleman who had visited Sir Humphrey on Monday evening. Willoughby admitted that this had proven surprisingly difficult, as Sir Humphrey's engagement diary contained only the cryptic notation J.H. Kent matter beside that date, and inquiries into the telephone bill had revealed regular calls to a number in Canterbury that the superintendent's men had thus far been unable to trace to any specific individual. Miss Marple smiled at this admission and suggested, quite gently, that he might wish to consult the records of Sir Humphrey's judicial career, for she suspected that the Kent matter referred to a case from perhaps 20 or 30 years prior that had possessed sufficient significance to warrant recent concern. She went further, offering the observation that a man does not generally receive agitated visitors late in the evening unless the matter at hand involves either passion or power, emotional entanglement, or the threat of exposure of something the man wishes concealed. Furthermore, she noted, the apparent ransacking of the study seemed to her the work of someone searching for something very specific, something that would fit within a desk drawer or a document folder, rather than the sort of indiscriminate theft that would characterize a burglary motivated by profit. Superintendent Willoughby listened to these observations with the concentrated attention of a man accustomed to extracting significance from apparently casual remarks, and he rose from Miss Marple's comfortable chair with the purposeful energy of one about to initiate new lines of inquiry. Before his departure, Miss Marple offered one additional observation, this one couched in the particular tone of gentle musing that she employed when venturing into territory that required considerable delicacy. She mentioned that, in her extensive experience of human nature, she had observed that siblings often harbored resentments of extraordinary depth, particularly when one sibling had sacrificed opportunities or independence for the comfort or advantage of the other. She wondered aloud whether Miss Violet's long residence at the manor, her apparent contentment with a circumscribed existence, might not in fact represent a life lived in the careful management of considerable anger at having her own possibilities foreclosed by family obligation. She suggested with characteristic understatement that a woman capable of suppressing her own desires for decades might well be capable of considerable violence if she were to discover that her sacrifice had been neither necessary nor appreciated. Superintendent Willoughby departed with these thoughts clearly occupying his mind, and Miss Marple settled herself with her knitting, aware that she had set in motion certain investigative currents that would either clarify the matter or muddy it beyond redemption. The following morning brought developments that seemed to vindicate Miss Marple's reasoning, though not in precisely the manner she might have anticipated. Superintendent Willoughby's men had, through a combination of patient telephone inquiry and consultation with judicial records, identified the mysterious visitor as James Hartington, a man who had been the subject of a criminal investigation some 30 years prior, when Sir Humphrey had been a judge hearing cases in Kent. Hartington had been accused of embezzlement from a legal firm in which he had been a junior partner, and Sir Humphrey had presided over his trial, resulting in a conviction that had resulted in a 5-year prison sentence. Hartington had served his time, rebuilt his life, and had apparently become a successful businessman in Canterbury. Yet apparently recent circumstances had prompted him to seek a confrontation with the judge who had sent him to prison. The superintendent's theory, which he shared with Miss Marple when he arrived at her cottage that afternoon, was that Hartington had threatened to expose some impropriety in Sir Humphrey's handling of the case, perhaps evidence that had been suppressed or testimony that had been mishandled, and that Sir Humphrey, rather than submit to blackmail or public exposure, had somehow hired someone to eliminate the threat Hartington represented. This theory, while possessing a certain logical coherence, seemed to Miss Marple to possess certain difficulties that the superintendent appeared not to have fully considered. If Sir Humphrey had hired someone to commit the murder, why would that person have ransacked the study? Why would the crime bear the appearance of passionate violence rather than careful professional execution? And most significantly, why would Hartington have come to the manor so publicly, speaking with Peters at the gates, arriving by taxi where the driver would certainly remember him, if he were engaged in blackmail that required secrecy? Miss Marple posed these questions with her characteristic gentleness, and she watched as the superintendent's confident expression gradually transformed into one of renewed uncertainty. She stared, quite carefully, that there might be another possibility that merited consideration, that Hartington's visit had not been motivated by blackmail or revenge, but rather by something considerably more complex, perhaps an appeal, perhaps a request for assistance, perhaps even an attempt at reconciliation born of circumstances that neither man had anticipated. She suggested that the superintendent might profitably inquire into James Hartington's current circumstances, his business affairs, and particularly whether he had experienced recent financial or personal difficulties that might have prompted him to seek out the man who had once sent him to prison. She wondered aloud whether a man 30 years removed from his crime might not have found himself in a situation where reaching out to Sir Humphrey seemed preferable to any alternative available to him. Superintendent Willoughby departed in a state of thoughtful confusion, and Miss Marple returned to her knitting, conscious that she was gradually assembling a portrait of events that bore little resemblance to what any conventional investigation would likely uncover. The superintendent's inquiry into James Hartington's circumstances proved to be the pivot point upon which the entire investigation turned, for what emerged was a narrative considerably more nuanced and considerably more tragic than either blackmail or revenge could encompass. Hartington, it transpired, had indeed become a successful businessman, establishing himself in the import trade and accumulating a modest fortune that had seemed secure until the economic fluctuations of recent months had imperiled his investments and his reputation. More significantly, Hartington possessed a daughter, a young woman of perhaps 28, who had been born during his incarceration and whom he had scarcely known during her formative years. This daughter, Margaret, had recently become engaged to a young solicitor of considerable family connection and promising professional prospects, and it was this engagement that had prompted Hartington's desperate journey to Thornfield Manor on Monday evening. For Margaret's fiancé, it had emerged through Superintendent Willoughby's careful inquiries, came from a family whose standing in legal and social circles was dependent upon a certain reputation for unimpeachable respectability, and the revelation that his prospective father-in-law was an ex-convict had placed the engagement in considerable jeopardy. Hartington had apparently come to Sir Humphrey seeking assistance, not money, though that would surely have been welcome, but rather some form of official acknowledgement or testimonial that might lend respectability to his redemption and allow his daughter to marry without a shadow of his past destroying her prospects. What Sir Humphrey had said to this request, what emotions had been stirred in him by this confrontation with a man whose life he had once so definitively altered, could only be surmised from the evidence of Mrs. Coleman's testimony regarding raised voices and apparent agitation. Miss Marple received this information with particular interest when the superintendent shared it with her, and she noted certain details that seemed to have escaped his full consideration. She asked, quite specifically, whether James Hartington had been a man of considerable physical strength, and whether his military service, if any, had been documented. When Willoughby confirmed that Hartington had served in the Great War and had been decorated for valor, Miss Marple asked a further question, whether the superintendent had considered that a man who had experienced the horrors of trench warfare and had rebuilt his life over 30 years might possess a particular sensitivity to injustice or the purse. Pshon of injustice. She wondered aloud whether such a man, if he had come to Thornfield Manor seeking redemption and had been rejected or dismissed with contempt, might not have experienced a moment of overwhelming emotion powerful enough to precipitate an act of violence he would subsequently regret. The superintendent seemed inclined toward this theory, which would have the advantage of explaining the passionate nature of the crime and the apparent absence of premeditation, yet Miss Marple detected in his reasoning a certain satisfaction with the convenient resolution that concerned her deeply. She suggested, with characteristic delicacy, that before concluding his investigation, the superintendent might wish to verify certain details regarding Hartington's movements on the night in question and his demeanor in the aftermath of Sir Humphrey's death. These verifications, when undertaken by the superintendent's men, produced results that decidedly complicated rather than clarified the matter. James Hartington, it emerged, had returned to Canterbury immediately following his interview with Sir Humphrey and had remained in his own home, dining with his daughter Margaret and her mother, Hartington's former wife, with whom he maintained cordial relations, throughout the evening. Multiple witnesses could attest to his presence in Canterbury, making it physically impossible for him to have returned to St. Edmunds and committed the murder. Superintendent Willoughby, when he shared this development with Miss Marple, seemed genuinely troubled by what appeared to be a return to square one in an investigation that had seemed momentarily to be approaching resolution. He sat in Miss Marple's parlor with an expression of frustration that suggested the comfortable certainties of conventional police work had been stripped away, leaving only the uncomfortable recognition that the crime before him possessed no obvious solution and no obvious suspect. Miss Marple, observing his distress, offered him a fresh cup of tea and made an observation that seemed almost tangential to the matter at hand. She mentioned that she had recently been reading an article in a medical journal that her nephew had left with her, purely by accident, she assured the superintendent, as she had scarcely understood the technical terminology, concerning the precise effects of various substances upon human behavior and consciousness. The article had discussed, among other matters, the properties of certain medications that could render a person temporarily incapable of reliable memory formation, and she wondered aloud whether anyone in Sir Humphrey's household had occasion to administer medications or prepare beverages for consumption. The superintendent stared at Miss Marple for a long moment, and then slowly rose to his feet with the expression of a man upon whom a significant realization has just descended with the force of revelation. His next actions were undertaken with considerably greater urgency than his previous investigations had displayed, and his inquiries into the medical history of everyone residing at or regularly visiting Thornfield Manor produced a result of considerable significance. Peters, the groundskeeper, had apparently received a discharge from military service that included treatment for a nervous condition, and he had been prescribed medications including certain sedatives that were known to produce the precise effects mentioned in the medical journal Miss Marple had referenced. Furthermore, when the superintendent personally examined the study once more, paying particular attention to Sir Humphrey's personal effects, he discovered among the papers on the desk a letter in Peters's handwriting, apparently unsent, in which the groundskeeper had articulated a deep and abiding resentment of Sir Humphrey that had accumulated over the 7 years of his employment. The letter detailed instances of humiliation, dismissal, and contempt that Sir Humphrey had allegedly directed toward Peters, and it contained language suggestive of a man whose mental state had deteriorated considerably under the weight of accumulated grievance. When Superintendent Willoughby presented the evidence to Peters with the accumulated certainty of an investigator who believed himself to have finally assembled coherent proof of guilt, Miss Marple was not present, though she would later receive a detailed account of the interrogation from the superintendent himself. Peters, confronted with the letter and the discovery of his possession of the precise sedative that might have been used to render Sir Humphrey incapacitated, initially maintained a posture of denial so rigid that it seemed almost theatrical in its intensity. He insisted that the letter, while authentic in its authorship, represented merely the emotional outpourings of a troubled mind and not evidence of intent to commit violence. He acknowledged possessing the sedative medication, but explained that he had retained his military-prescribed medications as a means of managing his occasional insomnia, a practice that was hardly uncommon among men of his generation and circumstances. The theory that he had somehow administered this medication to Sir Humphrey seemed to him patently absurd, as he had had no access to the study during the evening hours, and Sir Humphrey habitually prepared his own nightcap, a small measure of whiskey with warm milk, which he consumed in his study while reviewing correspondence. Yet, as the superintendent pressed him regarding his movements on Monday evening and his presence at the manor gates when James Hartington had arrived, Peters's composure gradually fractured. He admitted with visible reluctance that he had observed Hartington's arrival and had subsequently positioned himself near the study windows, driven by curiosity regarding who this visitor might be and what business could possibly bring a stranger to the manor at such an hour. He had heard, he confessed, the raised voices emanating from the study, and the tone of Sir Humphrey's voice, contemptuous, dismissive, cruel, had stirred in him emotions that he had spent years attempting to suppress. What Peters admitted to next proved to be the critical juncture at which the superintendent believed he had secured a confession, yet which simultaneously served to alert Miss Marple, when she heard the account, that something remained fundamentally amiss with the narrative that had begun to assemble itself around the groundskeeper's guilt. Peters had admitted that he had, in a moment of uncharacteristic boldness, entered the manor through a side entrance that was habitually left unlocked, moved by an impulse to confront Sir Humphrey regarding the treatment he had endured. He had proceeded to the study, where he had found the door ajar, and he had observed through the opening that Sir Humphrey was alone at his desk, apparently absorbed in reading the letter that Hartington's visit had prompted him to request. At this point, Peters's account became confused and contradictory. He insisted that he had not entered the study itself, that he had merely stood in the doorway observing Sir Humphrey, and that he had subsequently retreated and left the manor, returning to the groundskeeper's cottage, where he had remained for the remainder of the evening. Yet the superintendent, armed with his discovery of the letter and the possession of the sedative, seemed disinclined to accept this partial confession as anything other than an attempt at dissimulation designed to obscure the full extent of Peters's culpability. Peters was taken into custody pending formal charges, and Superintendent Willoughby appeared at Miss Marple's cottage the following morning with an expression of grim satisfaction, as though the resolution of the case, while perhaps not entirely satisfactory from an emotional perspective, at least possessed the virtue of coherence and conclusion. Miss Marple received this news with an equanimity that seemed to perplex the superintendent, and she asked several questions that appeared to him oddly tangential to the matter at hand. She inquired whether Peters had exhibited any signs of genuine remorse regarding the death, and whether his confession had seemed to her genuinely consistent with a man acknowledging his own culpability, or rather the grudging admission of a man trapped by circumstantial evidence and forced to confess to actions that fell short of the crime he was accused of committing. She asked whether the superintendent had fully examined the position in which Sir Humphrey's body had been found, and specifically whether a man of Peters's known strength and military training would have required such apparent force to deliver a fatal blow with a letter opener if he had possessed the advantage of surprise and the victim's incapacity through sedation. She suggested with the utmost gentleness that perhaps the superintendent might wish to reconsider whether the evidence truly supported the charges he seemed prepared to file, or whether instead he had allowed the comfort of apparent resolution to obscure certain details that remained troublingly inconsistent with the narrative that had been constructed. Superintendent Willoughby listened to these observations with the visible irritation of a man whose investigation had suddenly been rendered uncertain precisely at the moment when certainty seemed within his grasp, and he departed Miss Marple's cottage with considerably less satisfaction than he had arrived with. That afternoon, Miss Marple requested an interview with Miss Violet, and she arrived at Thornfield Manor ostensibly in the capacity of a village acquaintance, offering condolences and inquiring whether the household required any assistance in managing the various practical difficulties that invariably attend unexpected death. Miss Violet received her in the morning room with a courtesy that seemed almost mechanical in its precision, and Miss Marple observed with particular attention the manner in which Sir Humphrey's sister attended to her visitor's comfort and the specific topics that seemed to cause her tension or discomfort. When Miss Marple, with characteristic indirectness, inquired whether Miss Violet had been aware of the contents of the letter that James Hartington had apparently requested Sir Humphrey to write, a subtle shift occurred in Miss Violet's demeanour. Her hands, previously steady, trembled slightly, and her carefully composed expression flickered with something that might have been recognition or alarm. Miss Marple pressed gently forward, suggesting that it must have been a considerable shock to discover that her brother's judicial past contained elements that he had never shared with her, and that the appearance of this visitor from that past must have raised questions regarding the nature of the business that had prompted his visit to Thornfield Manor. Miss Violet's resistance to Miss Marple's gentle inquiries proved remarkably resilient, yet Miss Marple possessed the patience of someone who had learned over many decades that silence itself could become a form of communication more eloquent than words. She settled herself more comfortably in her chair, arranged her knitting upon her lap with deliberate slowness, and began to speak not directly to Miss Violet, but rather to the room at large, as though musing aloud to herself regarding matters that had occurred to her during her reflections upon the case. She observed that it must be extraordinarily difficult for a woman who had devoted her entire adult life to the service of another person to discover, in that person's final days, that she had been deceived regarding fundamental aspects of his character and his past. She wondered aloud how such a discovery might affect a person, particularly a person who had sacrificed her own opportunities and autonomy in the service of familial obligation. She noted that she had known Miss Violet since the latter was a girl of perhaps 5 years old, and she had watched with considerable sympathy the gradual narrowing of Miss Violet's world as her responsibilities to her brother had accumulated and solidified into what appeared to be an immutable arrangement. She mentioned, with careful understatement, that human nature possessed a remarkable capacity to tolerate injustice and humiliation up to a certain point, after which tolerance could transform quite suddenly into something considerably more volatile. It was at this juncture that Miss Violet's carefully maintained composure finally fractured, not into tears or protestations, but into a quiet statement uttered with the weariness of someone exhausted by the maintenance of falsehood. She said that Miss Marple seemed to understand certain things that other people did not understand, and she wondered whether it might be possible for her to speak in confidence, outside of the constraints of official investigation or legal consequence. What Miss Violet revealed in the subsequent hour fundamentally transformed the nature of the investigation and rendered the superintendent's confident accusation against Peters not merely inadequate, but dangerously wrong. Miss Violet explained that she had, for many years, been aware of her brother's judicial history in Kent, though the full extent of his involvement in the circumstances surrounding James Hartington's trial had been concealed even from her until recently. 3 months prior, a letter had arrived at Thornfield Manor from a solicitor in London that had contained allegations of extraordinary gravity that Sir Humphrey, in his capacity as the judge presiding over Hartington's trial, had been pressured by certain interested parties to ensure a conviction, and that evidence exonerating Hartington had been deliberately suppressed in violation of his judicial oath and his fundamental duty to justice. The solicitor's letter had explained that Hartington, having finally secured sufficient financial resources, had initiated a legal inquiry into the circumstances of his trial, and that preliminary investigation had uncovered documentation suggesting that Sir Humphrey had acted with conscious malice in denying him a fair hearing. The letter had concluded with a demand for a substantial monetary settlement in exchange for Hartington's agreement to remain silent regarding the matter, as public revelation of such judicial corruption would not only destroy Sir Humphrey's reputation, but would render his entire judicial legacy subject to review and potential reversal. Miss Violet explained that her brother had been thrown into a state of considerable distress by this letter, and that he had spent weeks attempting to verify whether the allegations possessed any factual basis. His inquiries had apparently convinced him that they did, and that his own conduct during the trial had been influenced by considerations that had no legitimate place in judicial deliberation. It was this realization, Miss Violet continued, that had prompted Sir Humphrey to invite James Hartington to visit him on Monday evening. He had wished, she explained, to acknowledge his wrongdoing directly and to offer not merely monetary compensation, but genuine contrition and whatever assistance he might provide in the effort to overturn Hartington's conviction or obtain official acknowledgement of the injustice that had been perpetrated. Miss Violet had overheard portions of their conversation, conducted in the study with the door partially ajar, and she had been struck by the genuine penitence in her brother's voice as he acknowledged the magnitude of what he had done and the suffering he had caused. She had believed at that moment that this confrontation might represent an opportunity for her brother to achieve some form of redemption through the acknowledgement of his sins and the effort to repair the damage he had caused. Yet when Hartington had departed and her brother had retired to his study, Miss Violet had observed something in his demeanor that had disturbed her deeply. She had knocked upon the study door and found him sitting at his desk, staring at nothing. And when she had asked whether he was well, he had responded with a question that she had found profoundly troubling: whether she believed that some acts of injustice were so fundamental, so corrupting to the very essence of one's character, that no amount of subsequent contrition could truly compensate for them. She had attempted to offer comfort, suggesting that acknowledgement and effort toward repair were themselves forms of redemption. Yet her brother had dismissed her words with a gesture that seemed to encompass not merely his immediate circumstances, but the totality of his existence. Miss Violet explained that she had left her brother alone that evening, retiring to her own chamber earlier than usual, disturbed by his state of mind, but not, she insisted, sufficiently alarmed to anticipate the tragedy that would follow. She had heard no sounds during the night, no indication that anything catastrophic had occurred, and it was only the following morning that she had discovered that her brother had become increasingly agitated during the late hours, apparently working through the contents of his study in some manner of frantic search for something that seemed to elude him. Miss Violet's voice became very quiet as she concluded her account, and she stated with devastating simplicity that she believed her brother had taken his own life by arranging circumstances to appear as though he had been murdered, thereby providing himself with the illusion of agency and control in the face of a future that seemed to him utterly devoid of redemptive possibility. She believed, she stated, that the letter opener had been placed in his back by her brother's own hand, using an elaborate apparatus of strings and pulleys that he had apparently constructed in the study, and that he had then destroyed the apparatus and arranged the evidence of ransacking to suggest that someone else had committed the act. Miss Marple listened to this revelation with an expression of profound sadness rather than surprise, and she found herself reflecting upon the curious paradox that the human capacity for suffering often seemed to exceed our capacity for healing. She recognized in Miss Violet's account the voice of someone who had spent considerable time constructing an alternative narrative to the one that official investigation seemed determined to impose, and who had apparently concluded that this alternative narrative, while perhaps not entirely provable, possessed a coherence and a humanity that the conventional explanation lacked. Miss Marple did not immediately challenge Miss Violet's theory, nor did she offer comfort with the easy platitudes that characterized most people's responses to tragedy. Instead, she asked a series of questions posed with the careful precision of someone seeking not to trap but to clarify. She asked whether Miss Violet had possessed any direct evidence of the apparatus Miss Violet had described, whether she had observed any mechanical construction in the study that might support such a theory, and whether she had carefully considered whether her desire to absolve her brother of the guilt of murder might not have inclined her toward a narrative that, while psychologically appealing, might not possess adequate factual support. Miss Violet admitted, with visible reluctance, that she possessed no direct evidence, that her theory was constructed largely upon inference and emotional conviction rather than upon concrete proof. Yet she insisted that she knew her brother, that she understood the depths of his despair, and that she could not believe that he possessed the capacity to commit deliberate violence against another human being, even in circumstances of profound provocation. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the slow deliberation of advancing age, and she assured Miss Violet that she would give considerable thought to everything that had been revealed. She suggested, however, that before accepting any particular theory regarding Sir Humphrey's death, it might be beneficial to examine the physical evidence with rather more rigor than either Miss Violet's theory or Superintendent Willoughby's accusation against Peters seemed to require. She mentioned, quite specifically, that she had observed certain peculiarities regarding the position of Sir Humphrey's body and the placement of the letter opener that had struck her as inconsistent with either the theory of deliberate murder or the theory of elaborate suicide. She suggested that a person attempting to construct an apparatus by which to inflict a wound upon oneself, while maintaining the appearance of external agency, would face considerable practical difficulties, particularly given the requirement that the apparatus itself be subsequently destroyed or concealed. She wondered aloud whether the superintendent might not be persuaded to undertake a more thorough forensic examination of the study, with particular attention to the furniture and the structural elements that might bear evidence of the elaborate mechanism Miss Violet hypothesized. Miss Violet seemed simultaneously relieved and anxious at this suggestion, as though she had simultaneously hoped and feared that her theory might be subjected to rigorous examination. That evening, Miss Marple requested another private meeting with Superintendent Willoughby, and she shared with him not Miss Violet's account, but rather her own observations regarding certain details that seemed to her to warrant more careful examination than the initial investigation had provided. She asked whether the superintendent had noticed that the position of the letter opener in Sir Humphrey's body suggested an angle of insertion that would have been extraordinarily difficult for a man to achieve against himself, even with the assistance of mechanical apparatus. She wondered whether the superintendent had considered that the apparent ransacking of the study might have been conducted not in search of a specific document or object, but rather in deliberate effort to create the appearance of a robbery-motivated crime, thereby directing suspicion away from the perpetrator and toward the convenient theory of burglary or revenge. She observed that papers had been scattered with a certain haphazardness that seemed to her inconsistent with the focused search that someone seeking a specific item would undertake. She suggested that the superintendent might wish to reconsider the evidence regarding Peters more carefully, paying particular attention to whether the groundskeeper's confession had been genuine or whether it had represented merely the capitulation of a guilty conscience to circumstances that appeared incriminating but which did not necessarily prove culpability. Superintendent Willoughby listened to these observations with growing discomfort, and he acknowledged that certain aspects of the investigation had troubled him, though he had been reluctant to voice his doubts given the apparent strength of the case against Peters. What the superintendent subsequently discovered, when he undertook a more thorough examination of the study with an eye toward the specific peculiarities Miss Marple had identified, was a series of details that suggested a considerably more complex narrative than either Peters' partial confession or Miss Violet's suicide theory could accommodate. The wound itself, examined more carefully by a physician summoned from the county town, proved to have been inflicted by a person standing directly before Sir Humphrey's desk rather than from behind it, which rendered both the murder theory and the suicide theory problematic. The ransacking of the study, when examined with greater attention, revealed that certain valuable items had indeed been removed, not monetary items necessarily, but rather documents and photographs of a nature that suggested someone had been seeking to conceal evidence of past misconduct rather than profit from theft. Most significantly, when the superintendent caused the letter opener to be examined for fingerprints, it revealed the clear impressions of two individuals, Sir Humphrey himself and someone else whose identity could not immediately be established through the limited fingerprint records available to country police investigation. It was this final detail that prompted the superintendent to undertake inquiries regarding Edward Ashford's past, inquiries that revealed a circumstance so significant in its implications that it seemed to reorder the entire landscape of the investigation. Edward's business in London, it emerged, was not a legitimate enterprise as he had represented, but rather a front for involvement with certain questionable financial schemes that had, in recent months, begun to attract the attention of law enforcement authorities in the capital. Edward Ashford, when confronted with the superintendent's discovery regarding his business activities and the fingerprint evidence linking him to the letter opener, presented an initial demeanor of shock and denial that gradually transformed into something closer to resignation. He admitted, when pressed, that he had indeed been present in the study during the confrontation between Sir Humphrey and James Hartington, though he had concealed this fact during his initial interviews with the police. He explained that he had arrived at the manor earlier than he had previo. Usley acknowledged, having driven down from London in a state of considerable anxiety regarding a conversation he had planned to have with his uncle regarding certain financial difficulties that had arisen from his business ventures. He had entered through the side entrance, as he had done countless times before, and had proceeded toward the study, intending to request a private audience with Sir Humphrey once the visitor, who was already present, had departed. Instead, he had paused outside the study and had overheard portions of the conversation between his uncle and Hartington, and what he had heard had transformed his understanding of his uncle in ways that he had found profoundly disturbing. He heard Sir Humphrey acknowledge judicial corruption. He heard his uncle express willingness to provide substantial monetary compensation to Hartington, and most significantly, He heard his uncle suggest that the corruption he had committed was so fundamental to his character that it seemed to him to call into question the legitimacy of any subsequent actions or benefactions he might undertake. Edward admitted that when Hartington had departed and he had entered the study, he had found Sir Humphrey in a state of profound despair and apparent suicidal ideation. His uncle had not seemed surprised at Edward's presence, as though he had detected the younger man's eavesdropping and had accepted the revelation of his past misconduct as inevitable and perhaps even deserved. Edward had attempted to argue against the despair that seemed to be consuming his uncle, suggesting that acknowledgement of past wrongs and effort toward repair represented genuine redemption, and that his uncle possessed ample opportunity to live a meaningful life despite his judicial failures. Yet Sir Humphrey had dismissed these arguments with a bitterness that Edward had found both shocking and, in its way, contagious. The older man had stated that he could not live with the knowledge of the suffering he had caused, and that he could see no path forward that did not involve either public exposure and legal consequences or an alternative form of escape from a life that had been fundamentally corrupted by his own actions. Edward had felt in that moment something shift within himself, a combination of frustration and anger, and a terrible, desperate sense that his uncle was moving toward a conclusion that Edward felt powerless to prevent. What occurred subsequently, according to Edward's account, happened in a moment of confused violence that Edward himself seemed unable to fully articulate or comprehend. He stated that he had attempted to physically prevent his uncle from what he believed to be an imminent act of self-harm, and that in the struggle that had ensued, Sir Humphrey had seized the letter opener from his desk and had pressed it into Edward's hand, urging him with an intensity that seemed almost frantic to complete what Sir Humphrey could not accomplish himself. Edward insisted that he had not wished to comply with this request, that he had attempted to resist, yet that in the confusion and the darkness of desperation that seemed to be consuming both of them, something had happened that he could not adequately explain. He acknowledged that he had, in some manner that remained unclear to him even in retrospection, been the agent by which the letter-opener had come to be embedded in his uncle's back, though he insisted vehemently that this had not been the result of deliberate intention to murder, but rather the tragic culmination of a struggle between two people both acting under the influence of despair and confusion. Miss Marple, when Superintendent Willoughby shared this account with her, listened with an expression of such profound sorrow that the superintendent N.D. himself moved to a compassion that might have seemed inappropriate given the official nature of the crime he was investigating. She asked whether Edward had attempted to obtain assistance for his uncle following the injury, and the superintendent confirmed that Edward had apparently stood in shock for several minutes before attempting to render aid, only to discover that the wound had been too severe. Edward had then, in what appeared to be panic and psychological disturbance, attempted to arrange circumstances to suggest a burglary or robbery-motivated crime, hence the ransacking of the study and the destruction of certain documents that he believed might implicate his uncle further in the Hartington matter. He had subsequently gone to his room and had taken one of the sleeping draughts that he habitually used while traveling, rendering himself insensible for most of the night and thereby providing himself with what he perhaps hoped would appear to be an alibi. Miss Marple observed that this account, while perhaps not entirely credible in all particulars, possessed a coherence and a psychological plausibility that the previous theories had lacked. She suggested that it represented neither deliberate murder nor premeditated suicide, but rather a tragedy born of despair and misunderstanding, and the terrible capacity of human beings to inflict harm upon one another in moments of emotional extremity. She wondered aloud whether the superintendent had considered the degree to which Edward might be regarded as a victim of circumstance, rather than as a deliberate perpetrator of violence, and whether there existed potential avenues by which the justice system might exercise appropriate discretion in determining charges and sentences. The superintendent seemed troubled by this suggestion, as though his official duty to prosecute was in tension with a recognition that the situation before him possessed dimensions that conventional criminal law seemed inadequately equipped to address. Edward Ashford was taken into custody pending formal charges, Yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by the conviction that the truth of what had transpired at Thornfield Manor remained obscured behind layers of confusion and desperation, and the human tendency to construct narratives that made sense of circumstances that might not, in fact, be capable of rational explanation. Miss Marple sat in her garden on a cool November morning, some 3 weeks after the death of Sir Humphrey Ashford, observing the chrysanthemums that had begun to fade as winter approached. The official investigation had concluded with Edward Ashford being charged with manslaughter rather than murder, a distinction that reflected the superintendent's recognition that the circumstances surrounding the death, while resulting in criminal liability, did not conform to the conventional parameters of deliberate homicide. Peters had been released with an apology, though the experience had left him visibly diminished, and he had subsequently accepted an offer of employment from a neighboring estate, apparently judging it prudent to remove himself from the village where his actions, however innocent of murder, had rendered him an object of continued suspicion. Miss Violet remained at Thornfield Manor, managing the household with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized her life for decades, though those who encountered her noted a certain fragility in her demeanor, as though the foundations upon which she had constructed her life had been subtly but fundamentally altered. James Hartington had written to Miss Marple a letter expressing his complicated emotions regarding the manner in which his quest for justice had culminated in tragedy, and suggesting that he had begun to understand that some forms of injury, once inflicted, could not be repaired regardless of the sincerity of the effort toward repair. The village of St. Edmunds had gradually settled back into its customary rhythms, though the events surrounding Sir Humphrey's death had left an indelible mark, a reminder that beneath the surface of provincial respectability lay depths of desperation and complexity that casual observation could never fully encompass. Superintendent Willoughby had called upon Miss Marple one final time, ostensibly to inform her of the formal conclusions of the investigation, though she suspected that his visit possessed an additional purpose. He sat in her parlor with the demeanor of a man troubled by questions that his official position prevented him from adequately addressing, and he asked Miss Marple directly whether she believed that the truth regarding Sir Humphrey's death had been fully revealed, or whether some essential aspect of what had transpired remained obscured behind the official narrative that had been constructed. Miss Marple considered this question with the gravity it deserved, and she responded with characteristic indirectness. She observed that human motivation was rarely simple, and that events of considerable consequence often resulted not from single causes, but from the convergence of multiple circumstances, each of which possessed its own logic and its own emotional weight. She suggested that the question of whether Sir Humphrey had deliberately sought death, or whether death had come to him as the tragic consequence of Edward's desperate intervention, might ultimately be a distinction without meaningful difference, for the outcome was identical regardless of the ultimate motivation. What mattered more, she suggested, was the recognition that Sir Humphrey's death represented the culmination of a long chain of events that had begun many years prior in a courtroom in Kent, where a judge had made choices that had consequences extending far beyond the immediate circumstances of a trial. She suggested that perhaps the most significant truth regarding the death was not forensic or legal, but rather moral, that Sir Humphrey had ultimately been destroyed not by Edward's hand, but by his own conscience, which had finally caught up with him after decades of evasion. The superintendent seemed troubled by this philosophical perspective, as though it represented an abdication of the clarity and certainty that his professional training demanded, yet he did not challenge Miss Marple's assertion. Instead, he departed with the understanding that certain forms of understanding transcended the official conclusions of investigative procedure, and that Miss Marple possessed a kind of wisdom that official authority could acknowledge but never fully encompass. In the weeks that followed, Miss Marple received occasional visits from various inhabitants of St. Edmunds, each seeking, though rarely acknowledging, some form of reassurance or explanation regarding the events that had disrupted their provincial existence. Mrs. Coleman confided her concerns regarding the propriety of remaining in Miss Violet's employment, and Miss Marple assured her that fidelity in the face of tragedy represented a form of grace that transcended conventional morality. James Hartington's daughter, Margaret, wrote to thank her for her role in ensuring that the investigation had pursued truth rather than convenient accusation, and Miss Marple responded with a brief note expressing her hope that Margaret's engagement might proceed, despite the complications of her father's past. Edward Ashford's trial, when it occurred, resulted in a sentence of 5 years' imprisonment, a length of confinement that seemed to the superintendent appropriately proportionate to the manslaughter charge, though Miss Marple found herself thinking frequently of the young man in his cell, contemplating a future that seemed to have been fundamentally constrained by a single moment of violence born from desperation rather than malice. As autumn transformed into winter and the village settled into the contemplative quietness that the season brought, Miss Marple found herself reflecting upon the strange alchemy by which investigation and revelation unfolded in human affairs. She recognized that the official resolution of Sir Humphrey's death, while legally satisfactory, possessed a quality of incompleteness that no amount of forensic evidence or legal procedure could remediate. The truth of what had occurred at Thornfield Manor seemed to her to reside not in any single fact or confession, but rather in the accumulated weight of human failure and desperation, and the capacity of the past to reach forward and reshape the present in ways that no one could fully anticipate or control. She understood that Superintendent Willoughby would continue to regard the case as closed, that the legal system would process Edward Ashford according to established procedures, and that the village would gradually cease to discuss the matter with the intensity that had characterized the weeks immediately following the murder. Yet she recognized also that in some ineffable manner the investigation had revealed truths that transcended the specific facts of a death and encompassed larger questions regarding justice, redemption, and the possibility of human beings ever truly escaping the consequences of their own moral failures. She returned to her knitting with the knowledge that some mysteries were never truly resolved, that human nature remained fundamentally mysterious, despite all efforts toward comprehensive understanding, and that the role of someone like herself was not to solve mysteries so much as to bear witness to the complexity and the tragedy that lay beneath the surface of ordinary village life.